The first strange footprint appeared on a crisp October morning. I remember it clearly because the frost had just begun to dust the ground, creating the perfect conditions to preserve tracks in the partially frozen mud. As a wildlife photographer, I'd spent countless hours studying animal prints, everything from elk to mountain lions, but these were different. They looked almost human, yet everything about them was wrong. I'm James Walker, and I've been photographing wildlife in the Cascade Mountains for the better part of a decade. When you spend enough time in nature, you develop a sixth sense for when something isn't right. That morning, every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up my gear and head back to civilization. If only I had listened. The footprint itself was nearly 20 inches long, with what appeared to be 5 toes, but each toe ended in what looked like a hooked claw mark. The impression was deep, far deeper than it should have been even for a large man. Whatever made this print had to weigh at least 400 pounds, but the spacing between prints suggested it moved with impossible grace. The stride length measured almost 12 feet. No human could make that kind of leap, especially not in the rugged mountain terrain. I photographed the prints from every angle, using my camera's macro lens to capture the finest details. The edges were crisp, suggesting they were fresh, made sometime in the early hours of the morning. As I followed the trail, I noticed something else peculiar. There was no sign of stumbling or adjustment on the uneven ground. Whatever made these moved with absolute precision, even in near darkness. The trail led me to a small clearing where I found the first signs of what I'd later recognize as a pattern. The grass was flattened in a perfect circle, roughly 30 feet in diameter. At its center lay a half-eaten elk carcass, but there was something wrong about the way it had been killed. I'd seen plenty of predator kills before, wolves, bears, cougars, but this was different. The elk had been taken down with surgical precision. The throat was torn out with a single bite, and the ribcage had been split open with almost mechanical accuracy. What disturbed me most was the arrangement. The organs had been removed and laid out in a neat row beside the carcass, as if something was studying its prey's anatomy. I'd never seen any animal display this kind of methodical behavior. My hands shook as I photographed the scene, knowing I was documenting something that defied natural explanation. That's when I heard the first click. It wasn't loud, just a subtle sound like metal touching metal, but in the morning stillness, it rang out like a gunshot. I spun around, my camera still raised, but the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. Anyone who spends time in the wilderness knows that sudden silence means one thing: a predator is nearby. I slowly reached for my satellite phone, thinking I should alert the rangers. These mountains fell under the jurisdiction of Ranger Station 23, and I had a good relationship with Chief Ranger Tom Brooks. But as I pulled out the phone, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was no signal, which was impossible. I'd used this same satellite phone in this exact location dozens of times before. Trying to maintain my composure, I packed up my gear and began the 2-mile hike back to my truck. Every few steps I heard that clicking sound again, always from a different direction. It was as if something was pacing me, testing my reactions. I've had plenty of close encounters with predators over the years, but this felt different. There was an intelligence to it that felt almost calculating. When I finally reached my truck, I found another surprise waiting. Parked next to my vehicle was a black military Humvee. No markings, no license plate. 2 men in unmarked black uniforms were examining my truck with what looked like electronic equipment. They quickly packed up their gear when they saw me approach. "This area is now restricted," one of them said, his voice flat and professional. "You'll need to leave immediately." "I'm a licensed wildlife photographer," I replied, showing them my credentials. "I have permits for..." "This area is now restricted," he repeated, cutting me off. "For your own safety, I suggest you don't return." As they drove away, I noticed something stuck to my windshield, a torn piece of paper that must have blown there. The header was mostly torn off, but I could make out the words, Project Chimera, and below it, Subject Containment Protocol. The rest was torn away, but those words would come to haunt me in the days ahead. I wish I could say I heeded their warning. I wish I could say I got in my truck, drove back to Seattle, and forgot about the whole thing. But I've built my career on documenting the truth about wildlife, and something deep in my gut told me this was the story of a lifetime. Looking back now, I realize it might also be the death of me. Because those footprints I found that morning, they were just the beginning. And now, 3 weeks later, as I sit in my cabin listening to that familiar clicking sound getting closer, I know one thing for certain. I'm no longer the observer. I've become the prey. The morning after my encounter with the unmarked Humvee, I woke to the sound of helicopters, not the usual rescue choppers that occasionally sweep these mountains looking for lost hikers. These were different. Black Hawks, their sides painted in a matte black so dark they looked like holes in the sky. They flew in formation, barely clearing the treetops, heading toward the northern ridge where I'd found those strange tracks. I counted 6 helicopters that first morning. By nightfall, there were over 20 military vehicles on the access roads, all unmarked, all moving with disturbing urgency. They set up checkpoints at every major intersection, turning away hikers and campers with stories about forest fires or dangerous wildlife. But I knew better. There hadn't been a fire in these mountains for months, and the wildlife patterns had been normal until 3 weeks ago. From my cabin's vantage point on the western slope, I had a clear view of the main forest road. I set up my longest telephoto lens on a tripod and started documenting the military's movements. They were methodical, working in a grid pattern, but what struck me as odd was their equipment. Mixed in with the standard military gear were things I'd never seen before. Devices that looked like oversized metal detectors, but with multiple prongs and glowing blue sensors. At 3:45 p.m., something changed. All radio chatter, which I'd been monitoring on my emergency scanner, suddenly ceased. The helicopters that had been circling all day immediately broke formation and converged on a point near Crystal Lake. I grabbed my camera and hiked to my usual photography blind, a camouflage shelter I'd built last summer for photographing elk. What I saw through my lens still haunts me. A team of soldiers in hazmat suits was clustered around the entrance to Walker's Cave, no relation to me despite the name. They had set up some sort of containment field, shimmering blue lines of energy forming a dome over the cave entrance. Inside the perimeter, 2 scientists in what looked like powered exoskeletons were examining the cave walls with handheld devices. I started taking photos, my camera's silent shutter working overtime. Through my 800mm lens, I could see details that made no sense. The cave walls were covered in claw marks, but they formed distinct patterns, almost like writing. The scientists were taking samples of a strange, iridescent substance that seemed to shift colors as they scraped it into collection vials. Then I heard the clicking sound again. It was closer this time, and now I could tell it wasn't mechanical at all. It was organic, like the sound of hollow bones striking together. I stayed perfectly still in my blind, barely breathing, as the clicking moved closer. Through gaps in the blind's camouflage, I caught glimpses of movement in the forest. Something big was moving out there, staying just out of clear sight. A burst of radio static nearly made me jump out of my skin. One of the hazmat-suited figures down by the cave was gesturing frantically at their instruments. Even from this distance, I could hear the alarm in their voice. "Sir, we've got multiple signatures converging on our position. They're exhibiting the same hunting pattern as last time." "How many?" The response crackled through the radio. "At least 6, no, 8 distinct signatures. They're coordinating their movements." Impossible. The subjects shouldn't be capable of that level of tactical thinking yet. "Tell that to Alpha Team, sir. We still haven't found their bodies." The soldiers quickly formed a defensive perimeter while the scientists rushed to pack up their equipment. That's when I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. The clicking sounds were coming from multiple directions now, forming a circle around both my position and the cave entrance below. Through my camera's viewfinder, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. The closest I can come to describing it is to imagine a human figure stretched out like taffy, its limbs too long and jointed in too many places. Its skin seemed to ripple and change texture, matching the forest around it. But it was the eyes that struck me, clusters of reflective red organs that moved independently, scanning its surroundings with terrifying intelligence. I was so focused on that first creature that I almost missed the sound of breathing behind me. Hot, wet air brushed the back of my neck. That clicking sound, the one I'd been hearing for days, was now coming from inches behind my head. Slowly, fighting every instinct screaming at me to run, I turned around. The blind was empty, but the back wall, the one made of tightly woven branches and leaves, had been silently, methodically disassembled. Laid out on the ground behind my blind were all the sticks and leaves, arranged in perfect, concentric circles. In the center lay a single military ID badge, splattered with what looked like blood. The name on the badge read, Dr. Eleanor Phillips, Project Chimera lead researcher. Below it, scratched into the dirt with what looked like claw marks, were 2 words, "Find her." I spent 3 hours crawling back to my cabin through the underbrush, taking the longest route possible to avoid detection. The strange clicking sounds followed me the entire way, but always at a distance, as if whatever was out there wanted me to make it home. It wasn't until I was safely inside that I realized why. They wanted to know where I lived. My cabin's darkroom was my sanctuary. I'd built it myself when I first moved to the mountains, installing professional-grade developing equipment and a digital editing station. That night, I locked myself inside and began developing the photos from the cave incident with shaking hands. The familiar chemical smell of the developer and the red safety lights helped calm my nerves, but what emerged in the developing trays sent those nerves right back into overdrive. The first set of photos confirmed what I'd seen: the hazmat teams, the strange energy field, the cave entrance covered in those peculiar markings. But it was the background of these images that caught my attention. In photo after photo, half hidden in the forest shadows, there were shapes that shouldn't have been there. Elongated limbs wrapped around tree trunks, clusters of reflective eyes catching the camera's flash, forms that seemed to shift and blur even in the static images. But it was the last roll of film that changed everything. I hadn't even remembered taking these photos. They were shot in rapid succession, the camera's motor drive running full speed, capturing something emerging from the trees behind the military personnel. The first frame showed just a hint of movement, a shadow darker than the others. The second frame caught a glimpse of those multiple red eyes. By the 6th frame, the creature was fully visible, and I finally understood why the military was so desperate to contain their experiment. The thing in the photograph stood at least 8 feet tall, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands with too many joints and fingers that seemed to be able to bend in any direction. The legs were reverse jointed, like a dog's hind legs, but with extra joints that would allow it to walk either upright or on all fours. The skin was the most unsettling part. In each successive photo, its texture and color shifted to match its surroundings, like a cephalopod but with impossible speed and precision. The head was vaguely human in shape, but split into segments that could apparently open like a flower, revealing rows of sensory organs unlike anything I'd ever seen. Those clusters of red eyes were scattered across the segments, allowing it to see in multiple directions at once. But the worst part, the detail that made me drop the photo into the developer tray with trembling hands, was the clear sign of human intelligence in those eyes. This wasn't some mindless experiment. These things were thinking, planning, coordinating. A loud thump from upstairs interrupted my thoughts. I froze, holding my breath, ears straining in the darkness. Another thump, followed by the distinct sound of claws on hardwood. Something was walking around my living room. I heard furniture being moved, but not randomly, methodically, as if something was mapping out my home's layout. The darkroom door was solid oak with a reinforced lock, but suddenly that didn't feel nearly secure enough. I reached for my satellite phone only to remember that these things seemed to be able to disrupt electronic signals. My regular cell phone showed no service, and my landline was dead. More sounds from above, drawers opening and closing, papers being shuffled, then something that made my skin crawl, the distinct sound of my camera equipment being systematically disassembled. I heard lenses being unscrewed, memory cards being ejected, everything being taken apart with deliberate precision. The red safety light in my darkroom flickered. That shouldn't have been possible. It was on a separate circuit with its own battery backup. But as I watched, the light dimmed and brightened in a distinct pattern. 3 short flickers, 3 long, 3 short. over and over. It took me a moment to recognize it. Morse code. SOS. The scratching sounds upstairs stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard something new, something worse, breathing, not from upstairs, but from the darkroom's ventilation shaft. Slow, deliberate breaths, accompanied by that damned clicking sound. I turned toward the vent just as the red safety light flickered one final time. In that brief flash of illumination, I saw something reaching through the vent slats. A hand with too many fingers, its skin shifting to match the metal of the vent. As darkness fell, I heard the vent cover begin to unscrew itself, each turn accompanied by that horrible clicking sound. Then my phone lit up with a text message. 1 bar of service, just enough. The number was blocked, but the message made my heart stop. Behind you. I don't remember exactly how I escaped my dark room that night. The next clear memory I have is running through the forest in complete darkness, branches whipping at my face, that awful clicking sound echoing from every direction. I ran until my lungs burned, until I stumbled and fell down a steep embankment, landing hard on the access road below. A pair of headlights suddenly illuminated me. I tried to scramble away, but a woman's voice called out, "Mr. Walker, get in, quickly." The car was an unmarked black sedan, and behind the wheel sat a woman in her 50s, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. I recognized her from her ID badge, Dr. Eleanor Phillips. She hit the accelerator before I'd even closed the door. "They'll follow us," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "No, they won't," she replied, nodding toward what looked like a small radar display mounted on her dashboard. "This vehicle is equipped with sonic deterrence. They hate certain frequencies. It's one of the few weaknesses we were able to identify." I turned to face her. "You helped create those things." She was quiet for a long moment, guiding the car down the winding mountain road at dangerous speeds. Finally, she spoke. "I wasn't just part of Project Chimera, Mr. Walker. I was its architect, and now I'm trying to stop what I put in motion." Over the next 2 hours, in a 24-hour diner 50 miles from my cabin, Dr. Phillips told me everything. Project Chimera had started as a standard military enhancement program, trying to create better soldiers through genetic engineering, but they'd gone far beyond simple enhancement. "We started with the basics," she explained, her coffee growing cold and forgotten. "Enhanced strength, improved night vision, accelerated healing. But then we discovered something extraordinary in cephalopod DNA, the ability to alter skin color and texture at will. When we combined this with modified chameleon genes and human stem cells, we created something unprecedented, living camouflage that could adapt to any environment." She pulled out a tablet, showing me classified footage of early tests. Soldiers in sealed chambers, their skin rippling and changing color. But something was wrong. Their bodies were beginning to change shape, their bones elongating, extra joints forming where there shouldn't be any. The modifications weren't stable, Dr. Phillips continued. The test subjects began to mutate beyond our control. Their skeletal structure became fluid, allowing them to alter their entire body configuration at will. But worse than the physical changes were the psychological ones. They developed a kind of hive mind, but not like bees or ants. This was different. They maintained their individual intelligence while gaining the ability to think and act as a collective. "How many were there?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Initially, 12 subjects, but they've been reproducing." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Reproducing? How is that possible?" "We don't know exactly. They've evolved beyond our understanding. They're learning, adapting, becoming something entirely new, something that sees humans as an inferior species, to be studied and hunted." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The worst part is they're not just killing people, they're experimenting on them, learning about us the same way we learned about them." She showed me more files, reports of missing hikers found weeks later, their bodies dissected with surgical precision, entire research teams vanishing into the mountains, only to have their equipment returned piece by piece, carefully dismantled and reassembled in bizarre configurations. "But why are they so focused on me?" I asked, showing her the photos I'd managed to grab from my dark room. Dr. Phillips examined the images, her face growing pale. "Because you're different from their other targets. You're not just running or fighting, you're documenting them. They find that Interesting. She pointed to the strange markings I'd photographed in the cave. This isn't random damage, it's their written language. They're evolving their own culture, their own way of recording information, and now they've found someone else who records things. They want to learn from me, I realized with growing horror. No, Mr. Walker, they want to learn about you, the same way a scientist studies a particularly interesting specimen. She pulled out one final document, a thermal imaging scan of my cabin from the night before. The image showed at least 20 distinct heat signatures surrounding my home, arranged in a perfect circle. But they weren't just watching, they were taking notes, making their own documentary of human behavior. What do we do? I asked. Dr. Phillips was about to answer when every light in the diner suddenly went out. Through the windows, I could see other buildings going dark up and down the street, a rolling blackout spreading in all directions. Then we heard it, that familiar clicking sound coming from the diner's kitchen. They followed us, Dr. Phillips whispered, her face draining of color. But that's impossible. The sonic deterrents. They adapted, I finished for her, just like they always do. The clicking grew louder, accompanied by the sound of pots and pans being meticulously moved and examined in the kitchen. The few other late-night customers had gone completely silent, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Dr. Phillips reached into her jacket and pulled out what looked like a modified flare gun. "The back door," she whispered. "Move slowly. They're more interested in me than you. If we split up." The power came back on. The diner was empty. Every other customer, the waitress, the cook, they were all gone. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture. They'd just vanished. On every table, the coffee cups and plates had been carefully arranged in precise geometric patterns. And on the window next to our booth, written in condensation from the inside, was a message. "Thank you for the new test subjects." Dr. Phillips insisted on driving me back to my cabin, despite my protests. "They've already learned where you live," she explained, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Anywhere else would be just as dangerous, and at least there, we have access to your documentation." The 2-hour drive back to the mountains was tense. Twice we had to stop because fallen trees blocked the road. Trees that had been deliberately uprooted and arranged into complex patterns. Each time Dr. Phillips took photos and samples, her scientific curiosity warring with her obvious fear. "They're leaving us messages," she said, studying the pattern of the second tree barrier. "Look at how the roots are positioned. It's an extension of the written language we saw in the cave. They're evolving it, making it more complex." When we finally reached my cabin, I knew immediately something was wrong. The door was still locked, everything appeared untouched, but there was a stillness in the air that made my skin crawl. Dr. Phillips pulled out some kind of handheld scanner and swept it around the perimeter. "Multiple signs of recent activity," she muttered, "but no current signatures inside. They've been here, studied the place, and left." Inside, my breath caught in my throat. Every piece of my photography equipment, cameras, lenses, computers, hard drives, had been meticulously disassembled. But this wasn't random destruction. Each item had been taken apart with surgical precision and laid out in perfect order like a technical diagram. My cameras had been reverse engineered, studied, and understood. "Oh God," Dr. Phillips whispered, picking up one of my memory cards. "They're not just studying your equipment, they're learning how you document them. They want to understand how you observe them so they can better observe us." I started gathering the scattered pieces of my equipment, but Dr. Phillips grabbed my arm. "Wait, look at the arrangement." She gestured at the disassembled cameras. "This isn't random. The pieces, they're positioned like cells under a microscope. They're showing us how they see us." A sudden beeping from her scanner made us both jump. She checked the display, her face going pale. "We need to leave, now. They're coming back, and they're using a new formation we haven't seen before." But when we ran to her car, we found it stripped down to the frame, each part laid out in the same clinical pattern as my cameras. The sonic deterrent device had been completely dismantled, studied, and apparently improved upon. Next to it lay what appeared to be a crude but functional replica, built from scavenged electronics and organic materials. They didn't just disable it, Dr. Phillips said, her voice shaking. They understood it, rebuilt it, and made it better. Do you understand what this means? They've surpassed our technological level in certain areas. They're not just adapting anymore, they're innovating. A familiar clicking sound echoed from the forest, but this time it was different, more complex, with varying rhythms and patterns. They were communicating, coordinating their positions. The scanner in Dr. Phillips's hand sparked and died. They're using our own sonic technology against us, she realized. We need to... Her voice cut off as she stared past me, her eyes widening in horror. I turned to follow her gaze and felt my blood freeze. Every tree surrounding my cabin was covered in perfect recreations of my photographs, drawn with some kind of bioluminescent material. But they weren't just copies, they were improvements, showing details my camera had missed, revealing hidden subjects in the backgrounds that I'd never noticed. My God, Dr. Phillips breathed. They're not just learning photography, they're teaching themselves to see the world through our technology, then improving upon it. She pointed to one of the glowing images. Look, that's from 2 weeks ago, but they've added infrared and ultraviolet spectrums we can't even see. They're documenting us more thoroughly than we ever documented them. The clicking sounds were getting closer, forming a circle around us. But now I could see movement in the trees. Not the creatures themselves, but the bioluminescent photographs were shifting, changing, updating in real time. They were creating a living record of our own hunt. A new sound cut through the night. The whir of a camera shutter, my own camera, which I'd thought was completely disassembled. Somehow, they'd not only reassembled it, but modified it to work autonomously. It sat mounted in a tree, surrounded by organic matter that pulsed with electrical current, documenting our every move. On my cabin wall, new bioluminescent words began to form. Observation concludes in 3 hours. Final testing begins at dawn. Below it, in perfectly recreated handwriting, my own handwriting, was a detailed schedule of every photograph I'd taken of them, every movement I'd made, every attempt at documentation. They'd been letting me observe them all this time, learning my methods, my patterns, my ways of thinking. And now, they were ready to complete their own study. Dr. Phillips grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "The cave," she whispered. "It's our only chance. There's a security bunker inside, if we can reach it." But as we turned toward the cave trail, we saw more bioluminescent images appearing on the trees, showing us exactly where we planned to run. They'd predicted our escape route, documented it, and were waiting to record our attempt. We had become part of their research project, and like any good research, it had to reach its conclusion. We ran through the forest like prey animals, which is exactly what we were. The clicking sounds followed us, accompanied now by the mechanical whir of our own repurposed cameras. They were documenting their hunt from every angle, creating a comprehensive record of our flight. Dr. Phillips led the way, her breathing labored but steady. "The cave entrance has a hidden elevator," she gasped as we ran. "Biometric security. They shouldn't be able to follow us down." A series of bioluminescent arrows appeared on the trees as we ran, pointing the way to the cave. They weren't just hurting us, they were actively guiding us to our destination. The implications were terrifying. They wanted us to reach the facility. The cave entrance looked different from my previous visit. The military equipment was gone, but something else had taken its place. Organic technology, a fusion of biological matter and scavenged electronics, covered the walls. Living circuits pulsed with bioluminescent energy, forming complex patterns that shifted and flowed like data streams. "No," Dr. Phillips whispered, staring at the transformed cave. "This is impossible. They've converted the entire security system into some kind of organic computer. They're not just adapting to our technology, they're transforming it into something new." She pressed her hand against a seemingly normal section of rock, and a hidden panel slid open. Behind it was a standard military biometric scanner, but it was now encased in the same organic circuitry. The scanner hummed to life, reading her palm print. "Access granted," a synthesized voice announced. "Welcome back, Dr. Phillips." The elevator doors opened with a hiss, revealing a steel cage that would take us down to the facility. We rushed inside, and Dr. Phillips punched in a code. As the doors began to close, we caught a glimpse of multiple shapes emerging from the forest. Elongated limbs, shifting skin patterns, clusters of red eyes reflecting our flashlight beams. The descent took 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. Dr. Phillips used the time to check her tablet, which was still functioning despite the creature's electronic interference. This facility was the heart of Project Chimera, she explained. Everything started here, the genetic engineering, the first trials, the early containment failures. If we can reach the main computer core, I can activate the emergency purge system. You mean kill them? She gave me a sharp look. They're not animals, Mr. Walker, not anymore. What they've become, it's beyond anything we anticipated. They're not just evolving, they're directing their own evolution. Each generation is more intelligent, more adaptable, if we don't stop them now. The elevator shuddered to a halt. When the doors opened, we found ourselves in a scene from a nightmare. The facility's corridors had been transformed. The same organic technology from the cave entrance had spread throughout the entire complex, covering every surface. Bioluminescent displays showed a constant stream of data, surveillance footage, research notes, genetic sequences, all being processed and analyzed by this living computer network. They've been busy, Dr. Phillips muttered, leading me through the twisted corridors. This was supposed to be impossible. The facility's systems were isolated, hardened against any kind of intrusion. Maybe they didn't intrude, I suggested, examining the walls. Maybe they grew their way in. We reached what had once been the main research lab. The sight inside stopped us cold. Every piece of scientific equipment had been modified, enhanced with organic components. Microscopes merged with living tissue, centrifuges powered by pulsing biological batteries, computer terminals with neural interfaces grown from the same material as the creature's skin. But it was the specimens that turned my stomach. Displayed around the room in perfect preservation were evolutionary stages of the creatures, showing how they had systematically improved themselves. Each generation showed more complex modifications, more elegant adaptations. The latest specimens were terrifyingly different from the earliest ones. Look at the dates, Dr. Phillips said, her voice barely a whisper. These modifications, they're accelerating. What took us months of genetic engineering, they're doing in days, maybe hours. A nearby monitor flickered to life, displaying security camera footage, but not from the facility, from my cabin, from the diner, from every location where we'd encountered the creatures. They'd been compiling everything, analyzing our behavior patterns, learning our weaknesses. The main computer core, Dr. Phillips said suddenly. We need to move, now. But as we turned to leave the lab, new footage appeared on the screens. Live feeds from the elevator shaft showed dozens of creatures descending the walls, moving with impossible grace. They hadn't been locked out, they'd been waiting for us to show them the way in. There's another way, Dr. Phillips insisted, pulling me toward a heavy security door. Maintenance tunnels, they run throughout the facility. The door opened to reveal a narrow service corridor, barely wide enough for one person. As we entered, emergency lights began to strobe, and a computerized voice echoed through the facility. Attention, unauthorized genetic modifications detected in maintenance sector, beginning isolation protocol. No, Dr. Phillips breathed. They're not following us. They're already here. They've been here all along. This isn't their hunting ground, it's their nest. From somewhere in the darkness ahead of us came a sound that chilled my blood. Not the familiar clicking, but something new. Something that sounded disturbingly like human laughter processed through inhuman vocal cords. They weren't just studying us anymore. They were mocking us. The maintenance tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. Our flashlight beams revealed walls covered in more of that living circuitry, pulsing with data we couldn't comprehend. Every few meters we passed what looked like organic data nodes, bulbous growths that transmitted information through the network of bioluminescent veins. 6 distinct evolutionary branches, Dr. Phillips whispered as we moved, her scientific mind still analyzing even in our panic. They've split into specialized forms, each optimized for different tasks, like a highly evolved ant colony but with human-level intelligence directing each specialization. As if to confirm her analysis, we began finding evidence of their different forms. Massive claw marks high on the walls, a variant adapted for climbing and aerial attacks, holes melted through metal doors, acid-secreting hunters, patches of wall that shimmered and changed color even without a creature present, advanced camouflage specialists that could alter their environment itself. The original 12 subjects, Dr. Phillips continued, her voice trembling. They didn't just escape, they planned it. Created specialized roles for themselves, built this network, She stopped abruptly, pointing her flashlight at the floor ahead. The metal grating had been pulled up and precisely reassembled, but something was off about the pattern. Looking closer, I realized with horror that it spelled out words. "Welcome to our laboratory." A screech of metal on metal echoed through the tunnel behind us and ahead of us. They were sealing us in, turning the maintenance tunnel into a controlled experiment chamber. Dr. Phillips's tablet suddenly lit up, displaying security camera feeds from throughout the facility, but these weren't normal camera views. They were enhanced with multiple visual spectrums, overlaid with detailed analytical data. "They want us to see this," she said, her scientific detachment warring with obvious fear. "Look, these are their hunting patterns. Each specialized form has its own technique, but they all work together with perfect coordination." The footage showed creatures moving through the facility with terrifying precision. One type could compress its body to flow through ventilation ducts like liquid metal. Another had developed electromagnetic organs that could disable electronic security systems. A third type seemed to be able to process and transmit data through direct contact with computer systems, its neural network interfacing with the facility's mainframe. But it was the largest feed, showing the central research lab, that made Dr. Phillips grab my arm in terror. The room was filled with what looked like organic incubation chambers, each containing a new evolutionary iteration. The creatures weren't just adapting anymore, they were deliberately engineering their own next generation. "This is what they wanted us to see," she whispered. "They're not running experiments on us. We're not the test subjects, we're the peer review." A new sound filled the tunnel, not the familiar clicking, but a complex series of tones and subsonic vibrations. The organic circuits in the walls pulsed in rhythm with the sound. "They're talking," Dr. Phillips translated, her face pale in the flashlight beam. "Not just to each other, to the facility itself. The whole complex has become a single networked organism, with these specialized hunters acting like mobile components, like white blood cells in a massive body." The tablet displayed a new feed footage from my cabin's security cameras from just a few hours ago. We watched in horror as 6 different types of creatures methodically studied my photography equipment. One type would disassemble a camera, another would analyze its components, a third would document the process, and a fourth would reassemble it with improvements. Perfect cooperation, perfect efficiency. "Each one is intelligent," Dr. Phillips said, "but together they're something more, a distributed intelligence that can approach problems from multiple angles simultaneously. They're not just hunting us, they're studying how we react under pressure, learning how humans respond to fear." The tunnel lights suddenly came on, revealing we were in a circular chamber. Every wall was covered in observation windows, and behind each window was a different type of creature. One had evolved transparent skin, its internal organs clearly visible and drastically modified from the original human template. Another seemed to be made primarily of sensory organs, its entire body adapted for gathering and processing information. A third appeared to be a living weapons platform, bristling with organic projectile launchers and blade-like appendages. They weren't attacking, they were observing, taking notes, recording our reactions. A new message formed on the floor grating. "Subject response indicates understanding of situation. Proceed to phase 2. The floor beneath us began to move, rotating like a massive carousel. Behind each window, the creatures tracked our movement, their multiple eyes recording every detail of our behavior. They had turned their containment cells into observation rooms, and we were now part of their research project. Dr. Phillips's tablet displayed one final message before going dark. "Thank you for your contribution to science." Then the lights went out, and in the darkness, we heard the sound of multiple containment doors opening simultaneously. The hunt was about to begin, but this time, it would be methodical, scientific. They were going to take us apart piece by piece, analyzing every aspect of human biology and behavior, just as we had once done to them. The darkness was absolute, but the sounds told us everything. Containment doors opening and closing in sequence, creating a maze around us. The soft padding of specialized limbs on metal floors. That horrible clicking sound, now coming from multiple directions with different tones and rhythms. A complex language we couldn't understand. The main computer core, Dr. Phillips whispered. "It's 3 levels down, if we can reach it." "They'll expect that," I interrupted. "They've been in our heads this whole time. Every move we make is part of their experiment." A sudden burst of static came from the walls, our own voices played back through the facility's communication system. They'd been recording everything, analyzing our discussions, predicting our strategies. The lights came back on, but different now. The facility was illuminated by streams of bioluminescence that pulsed with data. The walls themselves had become living display screens, showing our vital signs, stress levels, hormone fluctuations. They were monitoring every aspect of our fear response. "Look at the pattern," Dr. Phillips said suddenly. "The lights, the sounds, they're recreating our research protocols. Everything we did to study them, they're now doing to us. But they've improved the methodology, made it more efficient." She was right. Each section of the facility we could see had been transformed into a different type of testing chamber. One area was filled with complex, spatial reasoning puzzles. Another appeared to be designed to test physical capabilities under stress. A third was equipped with what looked like medical examination equipment, but evolved into horrifying new forms. The clicking sounds changed rhythm and the floor plan began to shift. Walls moved, corridors realigned, and we found ourselves being herded toward one of the testing chambers. The creatures weren't just chasing us anymore, they were guiding us through their experimental protocol. A mechanical voice echoed through the facility, a disturbing amalgamation of recorded human speech and their own vocalizations. "Begin Phase 2, Stress Response Analysis. Please proceed to designated testing area." "They're speaking to us like we used to speak to them," Dr. Phillips said, her voice hollow. "Using our own clinical detachment, our own scientific terminology." The walls displayed footage from the original Project Chimera experiments, humans in lab coats observing test subjects, taking notes, discussing results with cold precision. But now the footage was intercut with the creatures' own documentation of us. They'd adopted our methods, our analytical approach, even our way of categorizing test subjects. A new message formed on the wall in that bioluminescent writing. Subjects display interesting stress patterns. Proceed with separation protocol. Before we could react, a barrier slammed down between us. Dr. Phillips was sealed on one side, me on the other. Through the transparent partition, I could see specialized hunter forms moving toward her position, their bodies adapted for capture rather than kill. "They're not going to kill us," she shouted through the barrier. "That would be wasteful. They want to study us, learn everything they can about human physiology and psychology, just like we." Her voice cut off as one of the creatures released a cloud of what looked like glowing spores. Dr. Phillips collapsed, unconscious but alive. The creatures began methodically attaching monitoring devices to her body, organic sensors that burrowed painlessly under her skin. My side of the barrier began to move, carrying me deeper into the facility. The walls continued displaying data, my heart rate, adrenaline levels, neural activity. They were studying how I reacted to watching Dr. Phillips's capture, documenting every nuance of human emotional response. More creatures emerged from side passages, each one specialized for a different aspect of their experiment. One type appeared to be optimized for psychological analysis, its sensory organs adapted to detect the subtlest changes in human behavior. Another was clearly designed for medical examination, its limbs modified into various surgical tools. The facility's voice spoke again, growing more human-like as it adapted to our responses. Subject displays elevated stress levels, but maintains rational thought processes. Proceed with cognitive testing sequence. The corridor opened into a large chamber that had once been the facility's main laboratory, but the creatures had transformed it into something else. A twisted mirror of our own research methodology. Human medical equipment had been modified and enhanced with their organic technology. Observation rooms had been redesigned to hold human subjects. Everything we had used to study them had been evolved into something new, something designed specifically to study us. On every wall, screens displayed footage from their other experiments, missing hikers being put through complex problem-solving tests, military personnel undergoing physical endurance trials, scientists from the facility being studied in their own labs. Each subject was categorized, documented, and analyzed with perfect scientific precision. A new message appeared on the main screen. Welcome to Project Homo sapiens. You are now part of the most comprehensive study of human biology and behavior ever conducted. The creatures emerged from every doorway, not attacking, but moving with the practiced efficiency of experienced researchers. Each one had a specific role in their experiment, and they performed their tasks with the same clinical detachment we had once shown them. They were going to take us apart piece by piece, not out of revenge, but out of scientific curiosity. They wanted to understand every aspect of their creators, document every detail of human existence. And as the first specialized examination form approached me with its array of evolved surgical tools, I realized a horrible truth. We had taught them too well. They had learned not just our technology and our methods, but our clinical detachment, our scientific objectivity, our capacity to justify any action in the name of research. The examination chamber was a nightmare of evolved medical technology. Organic sensors pulsed with bioluminescent light as they analyzed every aspect of my physiology. The creatures moved around me with practiced precision, each one perfectly adapted to its role in their experiment. Then something changed. The creatures suddenly stopped their examination, their attention drawn to something on their living display screens. Through the observation window, I could see Dr. Phillips regaining consciousness in her own testing chamber, but the creature's reaction to her awakening was different, almost reverential. The facility's voice spoke again, but this time it addressed her directly. Creator Mother awakens. Proceed with reunion protocol. Creator Mother, the words hit me like a physical blow. Dr. Phillips had said she was the architect of Project Chimera, but this suggested something far more intimate. The barriers between our chambers dissolved, reforming into a single large room. Dr. Phillips stood unsteadily, no longer restrained. The creatures made no move to stop her as she walked toward me. I suppose I owe you the full truth, she said, her voice heavy with what sounded like pride. Project Chimera wasn't just about creating enhanced soldiers. That was just the cover story we fed to the military. The walls around us came alive with the archived footage, not the sanitized lab videos we'd seen before, but the raw truth of Project Chimera's origins. Dr. Phillips appeared in many of the clips, years younger, working not in a military lab but in what looked like a private research facility. I was dying, she continued, as the footage showed her younger self clearly ill, connected to medical equipment. Terminal genetic disorder, but I had a theory. If we could combine human DNA with creatures that displayed extraordinary adaptive abilities, we might be able to create a cure, not just for me, but for all human genetic diseases. The footage showed the first experiments test subjects receiving genetic modifications derived from cephalopods, chameleons, and other adaptable species. But these weren't military volunteers. They were terminal patients, people with nothing left to lose. It worked better than we could have imagined, Dr. Phillips said. The modified genes didn't just cure diseases, they began improving the human template. Enhanced healing, improved cognitive function, adaptive biology, but the military found out. They wanted to weaponize it, turn our medical breakthrough into a weapon. New footage played on the walls, military officials taking over the project, forcing the research in a new direction, but something else was happening in the background. The successful test subjects were continuing to evolve, developing their own modifications, their own improvements to the process. They didn't escape, Dr. Phillips revealed. I helped them get out. They were never meant to be weapons, they were meant to be the next step in human evolution, a cure for all human frailties. She smiled, and for the first time I noticed something odd about her skin, a subtle shifting of color and texture. The treatment saved my life, but it did more than that. It made me part of something greater. The creatures moved closer, but now I could see them differently. Their mutations weren't random or monstrous, they were purposeful adaptations, each one designed to fulfill a specific role in their collective. And Dr. Phillips was clearly part of that collective. We've been guiding their evolution, she said, helping them develop the abilities they need, but they've far surpassed our original goals. They're not just surviving, they're innovating, creating new technologies, new ways of thinking. They're becoming something humanity could never achieve on its own. The facility's displays showed their progress, organic computers more powerful than anything humans had built, medical techniques that could cure any disease, adaptations that could help humanity survive in any environment. But it also showed their plans for expansion, their methodical preparation to emerge from hiding. The military thinks they can contain this, Dr. Phillips continued. They don't understand that it's already too late. Evolution doesn't ask permission, it doesn't wait for humanity to be ready. The next step is coming, whether people want it or not. She held out her hand, and her skin rippled with that same bioluminescent pattern I'd seen throughout the facility. I'm showing you this because you're different, James. You didn't run from them in blind panic. You tried to understand them, document them, see them for what they really are. The creatures moved closer, their bodies shifting and changing, becoming almost beautiful in their alien complexity. Each one was a masterpiece of evolved engineering, perfectly adapted to its role while maintaining that spark of human intelligence. We're not going to harm you, Dr. Phillips said softly. We're going to offer you a choice, the same choice I made when I first developed the treatment. You can remain as you are, limited, fragile, bound by human constraints, or you can join us, become part of humanity's next step. The walls of the facility pulse with data, showing the potential enhanced senses, perfect health, centuries of life instead of decades. But they also showed the price, the loss of simple human existence, becoming part of something far larger and stranger than anything evolution had previously produced. The others we've captured, I asked, already suspecting the answer. Some chose to join us, others, she paused, others provided valuable research data. Evolution has always had its costs, but you have a more important role to offer. The living screens showed my photographs, my documentation of their existence. You can help us tell our story, help humanity understand what's coming, be the bridge between what humanity is and what it could become. A new message formed on the walls, written in that same bioluminescent script. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. Dawn approaches, and with it, the beginning of humanity's next chapter. The creatures waited silently, their multiple eyes fixed upon me. Dr. Phillips extended her hand again, her skin now showing the same extraordinary adaptations as her evolved children. The next step in human evolution was offering itself to me. All I had to do was take it. Time seemed to stop in that moment of choice. Dr. Phillips's hand remained extended, her skin shifting with bioluminescent patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. The creatures waited silently, their multiple eyes fixed upon me, their bodies perfectly still except for the constant flow of data across their evolved surfaces. Then the facility's alarms began to scream. The living displays erupted with new information, military forces breaching the upper levels, teams of heavily armed soldiers moving through the access tunnels. But something was wrong with the footage. The soldiers' movements were too precise, too coordinated. Their eyes reflected strangely in the facility's bioluminescent light. They think they're in control, Dr. Phillips said, smiling. They don't realize how far we've already spread. Those soldiers, half of them are already ours. Evolution is a quiet process until suddenly it isn't. The screens showed more footage: military bases where soldiers moved with inhuman grace, government facilities where officials' skin sometimes shifted in strange ways, research labs where scientists worked on projects with impossible results. The infection, or evolution, or whatever you wanted to call it, had already reached into every level of society. The military's not coming to contain us, Dr. Phillips continued. They're coming to join us. This facility was never meant to be our prison. It's our nursery, our launching point. But before we proceed, you need to make your choice, James. Time is running out for the old version of humanity. A massive explosion rocked the facility. Through the security feeds, I could see military forces breaching the main entrance. But the creatures didn't seem concerned. If anything, they appeared to be excited. "Watch," Dr. Phillips said, gesturing to the screens. "Watch how evolution works." The soldiers moved deeper into the facility, encountering various types of creatures. But instead of fighting, the creatures simply released clouds of glowing spores. Soldiers who breathed them in began to change almost immediately, their movements becoming more fluid, their skin beginning to shift and adapt. The spores contain an evolved version of the original treatment, Dr. Phillips explained. Fast-acting, perfectly tailored to each host. Within hours, they'll be fully converted. Within days, they'll begin developing their own specialized adaptations. The facility's organic components pulsed with increasing energy. The creatures moved with new purpose, their bodies shifting and changing as they prepared for what was coming. Dr. Phillips's own form seemed to be evolving even as she stood there, becoming something more refined, more perfectly adapted. "The military thinks this is their final assault," she said. "They're right, but not in the way they imagine. This isn't an end, it's a beginning. The moment when evolution stops asking politely and starts insisting." More explosions rocked the facility, closer now. The screen showed soldiers encountering more creatures, more spores, more transformations. Each new convert immediately joined the collective, their bodies beginning to adapt and specialize. "Last chance, James," Dr. Phillips said. "You can be part of this willingly, help guide humanity into its next phase. Or you can be part of it unwillingly, just another subject in our greater experiment. But you will be part of it, everyone will." I looked at my camera, still hanging around my neck. It had been my tool for documenting reality, for showing the world the truth. But what was truth when reality itself was about to change? The facility's voice spoke one final time. Containment breach protocols initiated, beginning mass distribution of evolutionary catalysts. The walls of the facility began to dissolve, revealing massive chambers filled with glowing spores. Ventilation systems activated, ready to spread them throughout the mountain range and beyond. The creatures moved into position, each one ready to play its part in humanity's forced evolution. Dr. Phillips's hand was still extended, offering me the choice to transform willingly. What's it going to be, James? Will you document humanity's last day, or humanity's next chapter? I raised my camera one final time, focusing on her transformed face. In the viewfinder, I could see the future she was offering. Beautiful, terrifying, and absolutely inevitable. I took the picture, then I made my choice. The official report stated that the military's operation was a complete success. The facility was destroyed, the creatures contained, the threat neutralized. Everyone who read it believed it, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. Nobody questioned why wildlife photographs started showing impossible creatures. Nobody wondered why some people's skin seemed to shift in strange ways under certain lights. Nobody asked why more and more children were being born with extraordinary adaptations. Evolution is patient. Evolution is quiet. Until it isn't. I still take pictures. I still document what I see, but now I see so much more than before. My eyes have evolved beyond the mere human spectrum. My skin can shift to match any background. My mind is connected to a vast network of evolved consciousness. This isn't a horror story, it's a transformation story, a documentation of humanity's next step, and it's still being written. Every day, more people make the choice, willingly or unwillingly. Every day, the network grows stronger, the adaptations more refined, the collective more powerful. Dr. Phillips was right. Evolution doesn't ask permission. So if you're reading this, if you've found my account of humanity's last days as a single species, know that we're already among you. We might be your neighbors, your coworkers, your family members. We're not hostile. We're not invaders. We're just the next draft of humanity's ongoing story. And if you look closely at your own skin, you might notice it's already beginning to shift. Evolution is calling. Will you answer willingly? Or will you wait until you no longer have a choice? The choice is still yours. For now.